Hey everybody, this is Robin at One Paper Street. Today I'm going to show you a really easy tutorial how to make a beautiful poinsettia Christmas card using watercolor pencils. So let's get started. I'm using the Faber-Castell Albert Dürer pencils. This is actually the only set of watercolor pencils that I own, but when I was looking for pencils, I did a ton of research to try and find out which were the most quality pencils. I have the set of 36 pencils, so I'll link to that below, as well as the colors that I'm using and any other additional supplies. Next, I found this poinsettia stamp and die set from Michaels, and I'm going to use it for this card. Lastly, I'll need a little bit of water, and I'll use 3 paintbrushes, a 2, a 4, and an 8. I'll also keep a cloth on hand so I can wipe off my brush if I get too much water on it. I'll start this card by stamping some Ranger Archival ink in jet black on some watercolor paper. The paper that I'm using is Fabriano Artistica Extra White Cold Press Paper, 140 pounds. And I just want to make sure that I have a nice clean image on my watercolor paper before I begin coloring. I also need to make sure the ink is completely dry before I start my project. I do want to acknowledge that I've sped up this video quite a bit so that I was able to fit all of the different steps into this video without making it too long. But please know that when you're watercoloring, it's completely okay to do it at your own pace, and it's also okay to put multiple layers of watercolor onto one painting. In fact, I think that's what makes it look so pretty. Now I'm starting with the holly berries, and you'll notice that I'm only coloring one side of them because I want them to look like the light is shining on them a little bit. And then I go back through with my number 2 round brush, and I just add water from the lightest part to the darkest part, and that helps me keep the appearance of shading. You may also notice that I very quickly run my brush over the lead of the Deep Scarlet Red watercolor pencil. This allows me to get a little extra paint on the brush if I feel like something isn't vibrant enough. In this case, I used it on the very first berry that I painted. I'll also wipe my brush off on the cloth if I feel like I have too much paint or too much water on the brush, and this helps me be a little bit more intentional with how I use the colors. Alright, now I'm moving over to the dark phthalo green watercolor pencil, and I'm going to use that first on my holly leaves. I'm using this color to outline the darkest parts of where I think the leaves would be. I'm adding it to the veins of the leaves and the very tips around the edges. I did bump the camera here, making it a little too shaky to share on video, so I apologize for chopping so much of the dark phthalo green out of this tutorial. Next, I'm grabbing my leaf green, and I'm going to use that as a mid-tone. So I'm using this color around the middle portion of the leaves, taking it all the way to where I think the shadow might be a little bit lighter than the dark phthalo green, and I'm just working that color right into the dark phthalo green because when I add water, I want them to sort of blend together. Next, I'm grabbing a color called Earth Green Yellowish, and I really like this color because I think it makes it look a little bit more natural, but it's the lightest green that we're going to be using, and again, this is going to sort of create those highlights on the leaf. Now you may also notice that there are sections of these leaves that are still completely white. I've not added any paint in certain areas because I want to go through and just leave those as light as possible. So we're almost ready to start watercoloring, but before we do, I always recommend using less water with watercolor pencils than you would with watercolor paints that are in a palette. I've found that these watercolor paints tend to lighten up very quickly, so applying less water keeps them more vibrant. So now for the big reveal. As I start to apply water, you'll see that all these greens beautifully start to flow together and blend together, and it makes an absolutely beautiful leaf. Now, my technique isn't random. What I'm doing is starting from the lightest areas and then actually moving into the places that I want to be darker. If I start to spend too much time manipulating the paint and pushing it around, then this leaf will end up looking all the same color. So if I start in those areas that I want to be lighter and bring the paint towards the darker areas, then you'll notice that I get much more contrast in my leaves as I start to paint them. I also have to remember that my paintbrush isn't my only tool here. For instance, if I get too much paint on my brush, I can wipe it off on my cloth that I have to the side. Or if I feel like I don't have enough water on my brush, I can always grab some more so that the colors flow smoothly. The other thing I can do is that if I do get paint in the wrong spot, I can dry off my brush and I can lay my brush back down on that spot and it'll actually pick up the paint that I don't want to be there. So using a mixture of these different techniques, I was able to create this holly leaf image. So let's talk about the poinsettia next. I used pale geranium lake on the inside of the flower petal, deep scarlet red, which is sort of a medium tone, on the middle of the petal, and then on the outside of the petal I used a dark red color. And as I add water to them, you'll see that they blend beautifully into the reds that you would typically see on an actual poinsettia. Now, if there's a place where you feel like you messed up, let the paint dry completely before you mess with it. You may decide to add a second layer of paint over top of it, or you may just decide to leave it alone. But if you start messing with it while it's still wet, then you're going to find that you create lines and imperfections that you don't want. And you may end up liking your painting even less than you did when you tried to make the changes. Once I was finished with the poinsettia, I started on the poinsettia leaves. I wanted to keep it simple, so I just painted each section of the leaf in one color using the 3 different colors that I used to create the holly leaves. I painted the other holly leaf and poinsettia off screen, and then I also cut them to prepare them for the card base. I also prepped my card base off screen. I added the sentiment Season's Greetings from the same stamp set to the lower left hand side of the card. I also added some dashes around the border of the card just to give it a little extra flavor. I'm placing my poinsettia and 2 holly leaves on the card base using some 3D foam tape as well as some just regular tape because I don't want the holly leaves to stick out like the poinsettia is. And then I'm actually going to take the second poinsettia that I colored in and I'm going to cut it so that it fits underneath the first poinsettia and fills in that little gap in the middle. Next, I'll turn the card over and trim off any excess flowers that are hanging over the edge of the card. After I was done with the video, I decided to add some black rhinestones to the card, and I think this really made it look special. I'll show the pictures at the end of the video. But that's all for our tutorial today. I hope you enjoyed it. If you like this tutorial, please feel free to check out more of my work at One Paper Street YouTube channel. You can also find me at onepaperstreet.com, where I post all my video tutorials and my blog post tutorials in one place. Thank you so much for stopping by and supporting our channel. I hope you have an amazing day.